Hi guys, Kevlar here. Today we are going to be looking at the recommended PC specs for Enshrouded. So Enshrouded has just been released on Steam as early access. It was available back in October for some beta testing, where I heard a lot of people struggled to run it. I heard people saying something about it needed, 19 gigabytes of VRAM and things like that, but now it's been released, it must have been optimized. And we can see on Steam the system requirements for PC. They give the minimum and recommended system requirements. So we're going to be going through these. I'm not going to get too techie into it, just going to explain what some of this means and help you work out where your PC sits in the range. Really, we're going to focus on the three main components: the processor, the memory, and the graphics card. The rest of it doesn't really change between the two specs, and they don't have a huge impact. So you've got Windows 10, network broadband internet connection, storage of 60 gigabytes available space, and onboard sound card. So first of all, what does the minimum and recommended requirements really mean? So I would say that the minimum system requirements means that you need this setup to play this game at 720p to 1080p resolution at low to medium settings to get 30 to 60 FPS. Then the recommended requirements, I would say that this is the system setup you need to play this game at 1080p to 2K at 60 FPS on higher graphics settings. So looking at the memory requirements first, as this is the easiest one to look at, they suggest 16 gigabytes of RAM for both minimum and recommended specs. This doesn't surprise me at all, as nowadays much less than 16 gigabytes of RAM you may struggle to play many modern games. The industry standard of getting a gaming PC or building one yourself is always to go for 16 gigabytes or more. So 16 gigs I would say is a standard people go for a gaming PC, and now it's getting more and more common to go for 32 gigs. Looking at the graphics cards, you've got the minimum specs of a GTX 1060 or an AMD RX 580. They have here in brackets that you need a required 6 gigabytes of VRAM. The 580 actually comes with 8, and there are two SKUs of the 1060. You can get the 3 gigabyte or the 6 gigabyte version, so you do need the 6 gigabyte version here. Then for the recommended specs, we've got the RTX 2070 Super and the RX 6700 XT. Again, they've said requirements 6 gigabytes of VRAM. The 2070 Super actually comes with 8, and the 6700 XT comes with 12. In my opinion, 6 gigabytes of VRAM recommended for the recommended specs of playing at the higher settings seems a bit low for this sort of game. I would assume you'd probably have to lower a few of the settings down to be able to stick to under 6 gigabyte of VRAM usage. I would say that 8 gigabytes as a recommendation sounds more like it. But then again, the graphics cards they have suggested have 8 gigs or more anyway. These recommended cards don't really surprise me too much for this sort of game. Both the cards are a few generations old from 2019, but they were getting into the higher end of the graphics card market at the time, and they're still pretty good performing cards. The best way to understand what this means and where your graphics cards sit within the range is on the Tech Power Up website. They've got a great tool here where you can select your graphics card, and then you'll see where it sits in relative performance to other cards. So here we've selected the 2070 Super as a recommended graphics card, and you can see here it is at 100%. If we scroll down a little bit, we also see the 6700 XT, which is actually a slightly better card at 120%. It's quite a lot better actually. So to be honest with you, I think they've made a mistake there, and they actually meant to put the 6600 XT, which is a lot more closer to the performance of the 2070 Super. So obviously if you've got a card around this area or above, then you're spot on for the recommended specs. Then if we go lower than this, all the way up to where we see the RX 580 and the 1060 6GB, all at around 50% for the minimum specs. So anything between that 50% and 100% mark is good for the minimum specs and up. So if you've got anything between these, so if we look for a fairly popular card like the RTX 3050 or a GTX 1660 Super, I'd say you're between the minimum and recommended specs, so probably get a good smooth gaming performance on medium settings. And obviously anything below that 1060 and RX 580 you'll start to struggle. So without getting too technical, use this website, enter your GPU and see where it sits in the range between the 2070 Super and the 1060 6GB. One more thing I want to say about the graphics cards is on Steam they have their Steam hardware and software survey, and actually we can see here that currently the 1060 GPU is still within the top 3 most popular cards of Steam users in December 2023. So it's still a very popular card, a lot of people are still using it, so good news for all you lot. You should be able to play this game on the lower settings. Back to the specs, let's take a look at the processors. So for the minimum specs, you need the Intel Core i5 6400 or a Ryzen 5 1500X. And then the recommended specs, we've got the Intel i7-8700 or the Ryzen 7 2700X. Without getting too technical on the amount of cores, threads and clock speeds and all that stuff, let's just go to another website. So Tom's Hardware is usually quite a good one to look at, but actually these CPUs are all quite old, and their 2024 survey has dropped most of them off the list. So I've gone back and I've found an old legacy 2020 to 2022 graph here, and still the minimum spec CPUs are not even on here. They're going to be down the bottom around here somewhere. So we can see here the Ryzen 5 1600X, which is the step up from the Ryzen 5 1500X that they've got the minimum specs. So I'd say we're kind of looking at around this ballpark here for the minimum specs. Then if we go up a little bit, we can see here the recommended specs of the Ryzen 7 2700X. So it's not a huge jump actually from minimum to recommended, but those minimum spec CPUs are quite low end, I'd say, in this day and age. And as there's so many CPUs out there, old and new, a lot more than there are graphics cards, it's quite hard to find a good graph or something that actually shows them all. So it's going to be quite hard to find your CPU on this list if it's in between those two. Obviously, if you do see your CPU and it's well above, then you're good for recommended. And if you understand the CPU numbering conventions, you can kind of work out where it sits between those two ranges. If not, a really good thing to do is just go to Google and just do a search for your CPU. Let's say you have a Ryzen 5 2600 and you want to see how it compares to the minimum spec CPU, the Ryzen 5 1500X. Just do a search for it. User benchmark is usually the site that comes up, and there you go. It will give you sort of a comparison here. So this percentage here, I'll just go by the effective speed. So we can see this one is 10% better than Ryzen 5 1500X. So we know it's better than the minimum specs, but we could change this now to the 2700X, see how it compares with the recommended specs. So here we see actually this top one here, it says gaming FPS, it's saying that the 2600 is a bit better, but that's wrong. So that's why I say go with the effective speed, and we can see here that the Ryzen 7 2700X is 3% better than the Ryzen 5 2600. It's not perfect. In my opinion, I'd say the 2700X is more than 3% better. But as I said, it's quite hard to find good accurate data on the CPUs. These are just a couple of ways you can check. So back to the system requirements, there's one more thing I want to say is about the storage. Now sometimes when you look at these system requirements, they will put in brackets or like an additional note to say an SSD preferred. I would suggest that's probably required for this game as well. Although yes, you only need the 60 gigabytes of available space, what they've said here, but most people nowadays won't use an old school HDD hard drive for gaming because it can affect the loading performance and they're a bit outdated now. So I would suggest to get this game to perform well, you're best off having it loaded on at least an SSD, and even better, a nice M.2 drive or an NVMe. Right, that's it from me. I hope you found that useful. If you do get this game, it'll be really interesting to know how it performs on your PC specs, especially if you're on the lower end. So it'll be really interesting to see how accurate they are with these minimum and recommended specs. So do drop us a comment. Let us know what your specs are and how it performs for you, and it will help other people watching this video. So thanks for watching. Please do give us a like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Cheers.